So welcome everyone to the virtual world of the Eastside Freedom Library. So virtual that I can be chairing this meeting tonight from Houston, Texas, where it's not snowing, having escaped from Minnesota, where it is or was. I want to welcome you to this conversation about an important new book by our old friend Joe Burns, Class Struggle Unionism. And we have a really great panel of folks who have read the book and are going to make some comments. Our plan tonight, tech-wise, we're in good hands with my colleague Bailey Ethier handling the tech. As we continue to learn in the virtual world of Zoom, Bailey is going to disable the chat for the period of the presentations themselves. And so you have to control yourself and hold your thoughts and questions, and then we'll have an avalanche of them. I do want to encourage you, something else that we've been learning in the world of Zoom is that we're happy for you to unmute your video so that we can see your faces. I think we all find that better than speaking to empty black boxes. So don't be shy about having your video on, but we will mute your mics until we get to the discussion part of the program. The plan tonight is to get a short presentation from Joe Burns about the book and the context in which he's written it. And we will then hear from Jane Slaughter, who was a longtime activist and participant in Labor Notes, has written a book called Secrets of a Successful Organizer. I don't know why she wanted to call them secrets, but we're going to share all those kinds of secrets tonight, hopefully. Jane is currently on the Labor Notes board. Then we'll hear from two local union activists and leaders, Shireen Horizok from AFSCME Local 3800, Kieran Knutson from CWA Local 7250. And then we'll hear from Steve Early, who is a prolific author and activist. He's had a bi-coastal career, having caused trouble in Massachusetts and now for some time causing trouble in California. And we've been delighted to have Steve at the Eastside Freedom Library. And then Joe will make a few comments back in response, and then we'll open it up. And we can try using the chat, and Bailey and I will follow the chat at that point. Or if people are well behaved, we'll unmute everyone and call on you. We know the world of either the mechanical paw or the physical paw to get recognized. So I'm just really thrilled to have Joe with us. My relationship with Joe goes back to his days as an activist at the University of Minnesota Hospital before it was privatized, before it was made public yet again. But Joe was president of the AFSCME local there. Then he went off to law school and has been working with the Flight Attendants Union. So lots of background fed into his book, Reviving the Strike, and then his book, Strike Back, about public sector workers in particular, and now his book, Class Struggle Unionism. I do want to also take a moment to encourage you to join us again this coming Monday evening when Daisy Pitkin will be presenting her new book, On the Line, a book about her experiences organizing industrial laundry workers in Arizona. and we have a panel of people from the labor movement who have read Daisy's book and will be conversing with her. And that will be this coming Monday evening, again by Zoom. So I'm going to mute myself and turn things over to Joe Burns.
Okay, thanks, Peter, and it's good to be on, especially with a discussion that's hosted by your group back in Twin Cities, where I learned a lot about, I know about the labor movement. So I'm just going to start off by saying a little bit. I wrote a couple of books, reviving the strike over a decade ago. And the reason I wrote that book was at the time, like hardly anyone was talking about striking, which is kind of hard to believe now because, the strike is definitely on the agenda for, I think most activists would realize that it's a key component. But back then that wasn't necessarily the case. And then I wrote a follow-up book, which was called Strike Back. And that looked at the strike and the public employee strike wave of the 1960s, both to tell the story, but I was also looking at, how were millions of workers able to violate labor law? And, so both of them were kind of looking at, the sort of union strategy through the view of the strike. I came to write Class Struggle Unionism because I came to realize that, and I think, probably prompted in part because there's a lot more discussion with younger activists about labor theory, but that we need to dig a little bit deeper and kind of go back to the basics in terms of ideas. And the fundamental point of class struggle unionism, in terms of what I look at in the book, is that for the first 100 years of labor history up until the 1980s, really there was the basic divide in labor theory were between what could be called the bureaucratic business unionists, and that would be like the American Federation of Labor, and later many of the CIO unions of the 1960s and beyond, the AFL-CIO. And a lot of those had a very narrow view that they were just representing a narrow group of workers. And importantly, they looked at the wage transaction, the transaction where folks go to work and they sell their labor from a very narrow viewpoint. Basically, they saw their role as basically negotiating for a fair day's wage for a fair day's work. But there's another viewpoint historically within the labor movement, and it's got a long, rich history. The industrial workers of the world, the 1920s, the labor, sort of alternative unions based around the Communist Party in the 1930s and beyond. And more recently in the 1970s when, thousands of radicalized students went into the labor movement and, embraced this philosophy of class struggle unionism. And the difference is pretty clear, and it stems from the workplace and how you view the workplace transaction. Class struggle unionists view it that, when you reach a certain age, you're forced to go to work, if not for one employer, then another. And during the course of your work, one thing you all have in common. You could be a truck driver, a barista, a nurse, a flight attendant, a clerical worker. It really doesn't matter, what you do. You bring to your job your labor, and your labor produces value. It makes whatever the employer has as inputs more valuable, and that is the key to why they employ you. And ultimately, it answers the question, how do we get billionaires in society? Because out of the workplace transaction, in millions of workplaces and workers working, you produce more, labor creates all wealth, and you produce more during your shift than you're paid. And that's how we end up with this oddity where we've got these people with $150 billion, which is, if you were paid an average, $50,000 as a worker, it would take you 3 million years to make as much as Jeff Bezos has in money. So it's a staggering inequality of wealth, which, isn't just rich. We don't look at it as just rich people, but we view it as a fundamental problem with the system. So out of that, comes two different slogans, and you can see it, right? On the one hand, you got the business unionists narrowly representing their group of workers, Their idea is that, we're just negotiating for a fair day's wage for a fair day's work. What happens after that, they don't really have control because they've just negotiated over the wages. In contrast, you get class struggle unionists who say labor creates all wealth. And we don't really accept the right of management to exploit workers in the workplace, nor do we believe that they should have the sole control over the products of our labor. So that's a very, very different viewpoint. And not surprisingly, you end up with a very different form of unionism. So some of the features of class struggle unionism, which differ from business unionism, I think there's about, 4 or 5 we can talk about. The first is obvious that the class struggle unionists, because they see themselves as part of a working class that's fighting against a business class, or they call them sometimes the capitalist class, they're fighting against, an entire class of people. For that reason, they seek to join all workers together and see themselves as their commonalities with workers. They're not trying to just narrowly represent their workers. In contrast, many of the business unionists have a very narrow point of view. Historically, the AFL unions, at the time that the IWW was welcoming all workers into their union, many of the AFL unions didn't allow African-American workers. They had immigrant policies. So that's a fundamental divide. But beyond that, there's also, the UE, the United Electrical Workers, calls it Dominus Unionism. Class struggle unionists see us in a battle with the employers. So we see that every single issue, we have differences with the employers. A lot of the business unionists will go for ideas like labor management cooperation as being key, trying to do, this interest-based bargaining. There's all these different mechanisms to kind of paper over our differences with management. But I think, the class struggle unionists understand that on every issue, we're apart. And when we win, they lose. And it doesn't matter what it is. I've been bargaining for 30 years. I know that. Beyond that, the class struggle unionists have a very, because they view that the workplace is a source of exploitation, tend to fight for work rules and fights on the shop floor and control over the shop floor, because they realize that workers are, what they sell to their employers, their capacity to work over a given period of time. And there's a natural struggle where the employer can, increase their profits by making workers work harder and longer. So those are the source of some of the greatest, battles in labor history. And there's a reason. And often the business unionists try and paper it over and, focus on just, small wage increases. I think we saw that in the strike wave of the last year in the production workers, where a lot of the aspirations of the workers were really tremendous. Get rid of two-tier, fight for residuals, and in streaming, the IATSE folks, fighting about weekend work and stuff. And then what comes back in a lot of these settlements is just really gets pared down to just getting some, increases, and then they barely pass these. But I think it's because of that conflict between the workers who want to change their conditions at work and those who are negotiating, who often don't share the experience. Just to hit on a couple points, one of the key features that I've known of class struggle unionists is that they strongly believe that because they believe that the workers are involved in a struggle within society, they believe that workers need to be in control of their own struggles, that they need to control their own unions. So you look at labor notes, which is one of the key institutions, that came out of the 1970s, formed by class struggle unionists, and it endures to this day, and TDU and other organizations. And they, at their core, they fight for union democracy and workers, control of their own unions. And then finally, I think in general, the class struggle unionists tend to have a more skeptical view of the government because they see that we're engaged in this battle. They don't see the government as coming in as our protector. They don't see that NLRB or these other institutions ultimately are really there to support us. And although we use them, have a skepticism about their role in society. So anyway, that's kind of the basics of the class struggle union approach. I'm just going to real briefly just mention a couple other concepts that I talk in the book, and then I'll wrap it up. So one of the things I note in the book, and this is something I've kind of lived through because, I caught the tail end of the 1980s, the massive struggles against concessions. And, I worked on that, with Peter, he was leading the P9 support group, and we did a lot of support work in the early 90s with Staley and so forth, and many of these battles. And, that was like this real sort of class on class battle. It had a really sharp edge. But in the 90s, there developed kind of a third way, a different idea of unionism that wasn't class struggle unionism, and it really wasn't the same as business unionism. I call it labor liberalism because, it's kind of it's situated between the two, between the radicalism of class struggle unionism and the conservatism of business unionism. I think it's kind of morphed over time, but like SEIU in the 1990s, on the one hand, they supported these broad demands, and they did a lot of good work in opening up the labor movement. But I think, as Steve Early has pointed out in a lot of his works, they embraced really staff-driven, undemocratic processes. And in many ways, we're sort of further away from class struggle unionism on some of these questions, like ties to the workplace, than the bureaucratic business unions that they claim to replace. Anyway, I think that class struggle unionism, because it's such a fundamental concept, I think we can run it through, and I do it in chapters of the book, through all of our sort of questions that we face. What is a class struggle union approach to tactics? So what are class struggle tactics, and how do they differ from other tactics that are employed by different theories and philosophies? What is class struggle organizing? How does it look different from the sort of organizing that we see? When you look back at the 1970s radicals, they put a lot of focus on building rank and file caucuses and reform movements and so forth. And I know folks still do that, like the teachers, that's been promoted. But that was that's kind of a core element of their organizing, and it differs from the sort of organizing that gets talked about these days, where it's just really a specific skill set rather than a sort of political, mobilizing agenda to transform our unions. Bigger questions of strategy and so forth, I think you can point back to class struggle unionism. So anyway, I think that's the, sort of general overview of my book. I really, I look forward to hearing what the panelists have to say about it, and as well as the audience members.
Thank you, Joe. We're going to turn first to Jane Slaughter, who has been a very important part of Labor Notes and imaginative rank and file focused labor organizing and activism for almost half a century at this point. So Jane, please.
All right, thanks. Thanks, Pete. I'll start by stating the obvious is that one of the many, many reasons we have to be ecstatic about Amazon is that it confirms the ideas that Joe writes about and that those of us on the panel have been talking about for years. I mean, talk about your bottom-up organizing, right? Something that neither business unionism nor labor liberalism knows much about. So the ideas that Joe puts forward about class struggle unionism are pretty much exactly, as he mentioned, what Labor Notes has been talking about since 1979. So for me, it was really great to see these ideas put together in one place, show how they fit together, what Joe calls theory. For example, the emphasis on the workplace, the need to break the law when necessary. As Joe says, the fact that the employing class and the working class have nothing in common. The way that he invents the term labor liberalism and makes it, a really sharp critique. It's always very comforting to read things that you agree with that are well argued. So thank you, Joe, for that. So anything I can raise, I'm sure that we'll agree on 99, if not 100%. I'm struck by what Joe says at the end, that too many people have just given up on changing the labor movement. He says that we class struggle unionists are not making demands on the labor leadership, but rather have fallen back on perfecting organizing techniques. And I think at least the second part of that, I know what he's talking about. There's a whole industry based on, if you will just do these 5 things that I will lay out for you, you will win. It is guaranteed. That is, if you have control of your local, and it is a large local with a large staff who can carry these things out. So that's great for those who are in that enviable position. But as you know, as Joe points out, it's not applicable to most union members. Most union members are not in a union whose officers want to go out and organize that way. So then what do? Well, Joe says we have to make demands on the later labor leadership. And that's one of the main points in his final chapter, make these demands. He thinks people have given up on this and retreated to their small corners. But what does it actually mean to make demands? Like, it could be sort of abstract. You know, you write your leaflet or your email, no, not email, your TikTok, and to say, this is what you should do. You know, we have the right idea. But I don't think it has to be abstract. I mean, I think Joe's right that we make these demands, but let's talk about concretely, how would you do that? Well, one way, for example, just one example, would be you're a convention delegate and you get together with the other convention delegates and you try to pass a resolution at your union convention that not just demands that somebody do something, but it requires them to do that. Like, for example, let's create a rank and file council of all of our members that work for the same employer with guaranteed rank and file representatives on it. It meets quarterly. It comes up with a strategy for organizing the unorganized at that employer. Okay, something very concrete. That's the kind of demand that we need to be making on our leaders. And the UAW is having their convention this July, and there's going to be a lot of that going on. So then I'd go on to say that one way that you, quote, make demands of your labor leaders is by trying to kick them out. And that would be by running on a class struggle platform and then continuing the organizing and the organization after you get your people in office to prevent backsliding. I'm very lucky right now that I'm working with some people that are running for delegate for the UAW convention. They're very green, but they hate the boss. And they're doing just what Joe said. They are aiming their fire at the employers and catching the UAW bureaucrats in the middle. And their 3 main slogans are no corruption, no tears, no concessions. So Joe is very right when he says that it's very easy for people who get elected to slide back into the culture they ran against. I have seen this dozens of times, and it's always very disappointing. But there is a way to guard against it, because we've actually seen it in practice, such as what the Chicago Teachers Union people did. They had a caucus. Who knew a caucus could be formed and 2 years later take over the local, but they did. But they maintained their caucus after they got in office. TDU, same thing. When Ron Carey got elected in the early 90s, and then again this year with this new slate that's gotten elected in the Teamsters, TDU is not going away. So it's not just electing new people to be in office, because individuals can backslide. It's about redefining just about every aspect, frankly, of our union's cultures. So I'm going to just raise one disagreement with Joe, which might be important in terms of morale. He says, in terms of class struggle unionism as a cohesive trend, we're probably at the lowest point of cohesion in over 100 years. So really lower than the 50s, lower than the 2000s. I'm heartened by the growing level of cohesion. 4,000 people were registered for the 2020 Labor Notes Conference before we had to cancel it. We expect similar numbers this June. You've got a growing number of people in DSA who are committed to class struggle unionism. They, reject the ideas that animated DSA's labor politics before 2016. There was a YDSA, Young DSAers conference this past weekend. all anybody wanted to talk about was labor. Now, that's not a cohesive trend, but it is some young people pointing our way toward the future. So in addition, we've got this movement in the UAW that I talked about. It's called UAWD, Unite All Workers for Democracy. It's still weak, but it's the first time since the 80s. You've got these new leaders in the Teamsters. They were elected in a coalition with TDU. They're saying all the right things about UPS, striking UPS and organizing Amazon, though I think they're going to have to move a lot faster than their original plan, which was UPS first, Amazon second. I think they need to speed it up a little bit. So I'm not going to make exaggerated claims for cohesion, but all those people will be at the Labor Notes Conference. And they'll get a chance to experience themselves as that class struggle. We call it the troublemaking wing. I mean, that's what Labor Notes has tried to do since 1979, is not only build the troublemaking wing, but help people to understand that there is such a wing and that they are part of it. And by God, when you're in a room with 3,000 or 4,000 people that are class struggle unionists, that's what you feel like you're part of. Luckily, the future of this wing doesn't depend on those of us who started out in the 70s, as Pete was so gracious as to point out. But there's a lot of young Turks out there, and I hope they will read Joe's book and they'll come to the conference and they'll go out there and make trouble.
Thank you, Jane. When we enable the chat, please put information in it about how people can learn about the Labor Notes Conference, just in case not all of us already do. Our next panelist is Shireen Horizok, president of AFSCME Local 3800. Shireen.
Hi, thanks, Peter, for the introduction and for the opportunity to be here tonight. I'm really excited to be in the company of everyone who's here, and in particular with Joe, and have this discussion and debate. And I just really want to say how inspiring it was to read this and to just see the a lot of ideas that I had and have had about the labor movement just articulated so clearly. I just view it as a clarion call for what we need to be doing, how we need to be waging battle, not only with the employer, but how we need to be waging the battle of ideas within the movement overall. That particularly resonated with me. I really appreciated the hopefulness that was there, even though like there was this level of critique for sure, and just very and I think well-placed and harsh criticism that needs to be done. Joe pulled no punches in laying out what's wrong, but I think it comes from a level of hopefulness that I think, for those of us that are doing day-to-day organizing on the shop floor, we see that, we're coming up against the boss every day. It can be really hard. It can be exhausting. And I think about that within the context of the pandemic and all of the organizing that people are doing, and just the crisis that people have been in. And yet there's this level of hopefulness that never goes away, because people know that we need something more and want to be a part of that and want to fight that. So I really do appreciate the hopefulness and and think that it is a time to be hopeful, while also kind of waging that battle. A couple of things that I wanted to touch on in the discussion. I think Jane talked a bit about it. I'm not going to actually talk about the organizing at Amazon, although it is incredibly inspiring. I think it's in looking at what happened in Staten Island and the organizing that happened there, and compare that to the organizing in Bessemer. I think you can really look at two different approaches and what resonates with people. I think there are a lot of lessons to pull out of it. But one of the most important things that I took out of reading the book was the need for more rank and file workers to really wage battle over the ideas and strategy that we're putting forward. We're carrying out these fights on a daily basis, but the labor liberals are really winning the battle of ideas. And even though, the kind of business unionism is the vast majority of the labor movement, I think when it comes to the, kind of what people are thinking about and what is, what are the ideas that are circulating out there, I think that what Joe labels the labor liberals really has an outsized influence, not just within, those who, I think within class struggle unionists, I think those who are progressive unionists, I think those who are business unionists as well. It's the ideas that are driving the day. And I think that really, the contribution that Joe made over assessing that and really differentiating between class struggle unionism and not talking about social movement unionism, but instead calling it labor liberalism, I think is a profound contribution and makes it much clearer for people about what needs to be done. I think, it's a clear call for people to write more and speak out more and propagandize more. Another thing that really resonated for me just, in the past month, we've seen the educator strike here in Minneapolis, and it was profoundly motivating, inspiring, incredible lessons to draw from that. And I think summing up with that, but the thing that I drew from Joe's book around it was like, if folks have the book with them on page 112, where he talks about the role of kind of ultra leftists and armchair revolutionaries, and how they view strikes. And I think we've seen that some in the summation and discussion of the strike, while it was going on and after the fact. And, it's just so clear that strikes are really transformative on so many levels. In 2007, 2,500 clerical, technical, and healthcare workers at the U of M went on strike, and it was life-changing for so many of us. And it was one of only 8 major strikes in the US at that time. But, part of what you learn in doing that is, you learn to have freedom from the oppression of the bosses every day, breathing down your neck about how things should be done. And you realize that you have power when you come together as workers. And on that picket line, there's no greater joy than, I would say, midway through the first day on strike, when you realize that you have incredible power and that you're stronger together without the bosses there, right? And that is really, it's profound and transformative. But strikes also show how difficult it is to win, right? And the limitations of what those wins can be within the context of capitalism, within the context of the system that is really set up to crush us, with the labor laws that exist, with the political system that's there. And it can be really challenging. And I think that what Joe lays out is that when you're evaluating what a strike, whether it's victorious or not, that you have to look at a number of key questions. And some of the questions that are laid out are, did we fight for all that could be won? Did we put management to the test? Did we win all that could be won in the course of struggle? And that there are those who are just critiquist and will say, no strike is ever good enough. No settlement is ever good enough. The leadership is always sellouts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think, and I've, followed stuff online in the aftermath of the strike for the educators. And I think that in the criteria that Joe lays out, I think that it was a win. I think that it was incredibly transformative. I think that the educators pushed it as far as they could at the given time. I think that they won a lot of things. Did they win everything? everything they wanted? Absolutely not. Did they win everything they needed? No. But did they win all that could be won at that time? And more importantly, did they form a stronger organization that was profoundly transformed in terms of how they viewed society, how they view the role of the governor in Minnesota and, you know, the educator in chief who did nothing? I think that on an organizational level and on an understanding of how the system works and an understanding of how, you know, what needs to be done and how to continue building that fight, I think on those levels, in addition to, you know, some real economic gains, not as much as they had wanted, but real economic gains, I think they really moved it forward, you know, and I think, you know, that was just in reading the book really resonated. And then I just wanted to go back to the point about kind of labor liberalism and how important that is. And as someone who does organizing within higher education, I think, and in the public sector, I think it particularly resonates kind of the kind of both the best elements and the worst elements of social movement unionism. Like we operate in a world of ideas that's there. And I think, you know, in education and higher education, you know, what's not to like about bargaining for the common good? What's not to like about that? You know, but I think the book really lays out a sharp differentiation between class struggle unionism and labor liberalism. One thing that I just wanted to contribute in that and thinking it through is that, you know, again, I think it especially resonates for those you know, who are in workplaces where there's like a real call for people to strive to be middle class and to not think of themselves as workers. And in, you know, at the U, a lot of our members will identify more closely with their supervisors who sit in the desk right next to them than they do with their with a unionized coworker who's two doors down, you know. And so you know, we tend to talk about it as the Stockholm Syndrome, you know, where people don't want to raise a fuss, they want to get along, they want to be comfortable in the workplace, and that for them, it's a lot easier to think about social justice issues outside the workplace and mobilize around that than it is to really take on the boss. But what we've seen is over and over again is that when we're sharpest in drawing the battle lines, that's when most people get involved, and it really does transform and strengthen our union. So it's when we've organized the Chop from the Top campaign, when we raise slogans that it's not a budget crisis, it's a distribution crisis, that then we actually see these folks who would otherwise just identify more with the boss are now identifying with their coworkers, and it strengthens our union. So I think that there's a level too of how just in a direct workplace setting that if you're not really sharp about it, it just waters things down. And so, you know, one of the questions, I was talking to some members in our local about what questions to bring into the discussion tonight. And one of the things that came up was just how, you know, how the influence of labor liberalism and social movement unionism is really just so strong out there. It is the dominant thought, and is pervasive in a lot of the sectors that our folks organize within. And so what are like steps concretely to really fight against and work to transform their, you know, for folks that are within unions that base themselves on like the social movement unionism or the liberal labor liberalism, how like carrying out that battle for ideas within their locals and putting the local on a class struggle footing when it's maybe not fighting against, you know, it's not fighting against bureaucratic business unionism. It's fighting against the bureaucratic, I would say as well, labor liberalism, and waging those battles. So, but thank you so much, Joe, for a book that I think will be profoundly influential.
Thank you, Shireen. Next, we're going to hear from Karen Knutson, who is the president of CWA Local 7250, representing workers employed by AT&T across the state of Minnesota. Karen?
Hey, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to be a part of this. My name is Kieran. I've been president of CWA 7250 now for just over a year. Prior to that, I was a chief steward and a steward at AT&T for the last 15 or so years. And prior to that, I worked at UPS for 10 years and was active there. I guess I just want to say I think it's a great fucking book. I think Joe is probably the most important labor writer out there right now. I think his book is simple but not simplistic. And I think he takes important concepts and underlines them 3 or 4 times to really hit home, but also elaborates on them and gives concrete examples of how they apply. So I think it's really important that that the book be promoted, and that it be promoted to workers, and that the book, that we create some opportunities for discussion around the book and the concepts in the book, and that we look to identify more explicitly a class struggle trend within the labor movement that sees itself as that. I have a bunch of questions about what that might be at this point. So I'll try and get into that a little bit. I just want to say a little bit about my experience. One of the things I liked about the book as well, Shireen made reference to this, is I feel like it articulated things that either instinctually I've been doing or feeling, or activity that we have been doing in the workplace, but haven't always articulated as clearly and concisely as this book. And so, like, in our own experience in our local, we kind of overturned some stagnant business unionist models in our CWA local. And one of the big things that we did when I won chief steward initially was to recruit a bunch of people to be stewards. Previously, in the call center that I worked at, it was a small number of white male stewards, and we changed that. We changed it from being about 5 stewards to 15 stewards, made it majority women, majority people of color, majority Black. And that also transformed the way that other workers saw the union. So the union was no longer seen as just the property of a certain group of workers, but was open to everybody. And there was likely at least one steward that everybody in the call center felt comfortable talking with. And then we were really combative with the bosses. One of the big things that we fought about was the issue of respect. And we just made it, we had flyers with Aretha Franklin up all over the call center. That doesn't work as well anymore, unfortunately, because the younger workers don't know who Aretha Franklin is, believe it or not. But we made it a big issue. And so any manager that developed a reputation as being consistently disrespectful to our people, we would conduct a campaign against them. And in 2 cases, we were able to force them out of the job entirely. And a number of other managers have retired with their chief reason being the control that the union has in our workplace. So I thought Joe's emphasis on the control of the workplace and the battle in the workplace was really important, because I think sometimes that actually gets, talked about as if that's bread and butter unionism, and it's not. It's sort of conservative rather than allowing. For us, it was the way to show what we meant by the big ideas that we have, and a way of showing what our attitude was in general towards the world, because people then understood that the things that we say about the government are tied to the way that we talk about the managers. And I think that that's a really important lesson. I also totally agree that it's time to start talking about the need to defy the law. There's no other way around it. I think Joe says that. We got to it's not an easy thing to resolve. I remember a number of us were involved in supporting the airline mechanics at the old Northwest Airline when they went on strike. And because they were in this kind of small independent union, which says something about the importance of experimenting with different kinds of models, I think. But because they were part of this sort of weird independent union, they had this incredible amount of democracy within their union. And they were willing to engage in some really militant tactics. But the very next day after we pulled off this very ambitious action that shut down the ability for the scabs to arrive on time to their jobs, the president of this AMFA local got hit with an injunction and a huge, a threat of a fine of a huge amount of money personally on him, not the union, but him as an individual. And so it's not something that is, sort of easily overcomable, but I think it is something that we need to start talking about and organizing around and thinking about and strategizing about how to defy the law effectively. A couple things I think I want to try and maybe challenge a little bit too within the book, just to show that I'm not just Joe's fanboy, is I think that some of the historical examples that were used within the book, I think, are useful and good for rooting the discussion and stuff that's actually happened. That Joe's not just making this stuff up. This is actually based on stuff that real workers have actually done in the real world. I thought that the discussion of the Communist Party was a little bit one-sided. In particular, I think he singles out admirable moments in the Communist Party's history of pushing class struggle forward. But I think there was a whole period where the Communist Party was actually part of the labor control system in the United States, particularly the no strike pledge stuff, and how that carried out a sort of reactionary policy and paved the way for more repression of class struggle unionists. And that would also include the period where the Communist Party went along with the internment of Japanese Americans in the United States. I think that the issue about making demands of, I think this is probably more semantic than it is substantive disagreement. But I think that the way that I've tried to frame it, or we should frame it, I think, because I think there's a lot of times a lot of left groups there, when they say make demands, they have this kind of laundry list and they present it in this very sort of wooden way. But I think what we want to do is instead of making demands on the leaders to do something, we're making proposals to the membership to do something. And that if the leaders choose to get in the way of that or act bureaucratically to prevent that, then that's a lesson for everybody, I think, to see. And I think probably Joe doesn't disagree with that, but I just wanted to express that. And then finally, and this is something that goes back to a little disagreement I tried to raise with Joe a little while ago in a different writing about the idea of general strikes or mass strikes, because the book only teases on that a little bit. And I'm actually hoping maybe we can convince him to make that a future book. I think there's something to be discussed about. Joe kind of talks about one end of stuff where I think he kind of presented a sort of middle-class activists calling phony general strikes or calling on unions to do something when they themselves haven't, done the work or earned the credit or put themselves in a position to call strikes. But I think there's something, and that does happen, and that should be criticized, and it's not really helpful and whatever. But I think there's something else that's going on in this country right now of the phenomena of mass insurgency. And maybe it's living in Minneapolis, the headquarters of World Revolution, that I see this and understand this more. But I think there's going to be moments where working class people beyond just the forms of unions are going to be pressuring the labor movement to take action beyond what is normally taken. And I think the Wisconsin example is an easier one to understand because it was largely within the labor movement. And there's one thing that I think Joe actually gets a little bit wrong in that book. He refers to that the Democratic Party's recall strategy took off as the momentum of the uprising in Wisconsin went down. But I actually think the recall was what caused the momentum of the uprising to go down in Wisconsin. And part of it was because the only way forward in Wisconsin was the concept of a mass strike or some kind of general strike. And it wasn't just something that kind of, Trotskyists with newspapers were talking about. It was something that was being talked about broadly on the streets of Madison and in towns all over Wisconsin. And it was, I have some inside baseball on that too. It was actually talked about within the Wisconsin AFL-CIO executive board, but they were talking about how to stop it from happening, not how to make it happen. So I do think there needs to be more discussion about the interplay between sort of spontaneous mass movements, like the stuff that erupted around the George Floyd rebellion and the labor movement, and how the responsibility of unions to try and meet that moment with the rest of the people that are moving forward. So I probably talked too much, and that's it. I just really encourage everyone to read the book.
Great, thank you, Kieran. We're just going to have to bleep out your use of the F word when we edit the final video. All right, Brother Early, you're batting cleanup as you asked.
Thanks for the trigger warning about use of bad language. I have been a longtime fan of Joe's work, big fan of all of his books. This one in particular definitely resonates with my experience as a full-time national staff member or rank and file member of CWA for the last 40 years. For 30 of those years, I was like Joe as a negotiator for the flight attendants, which is affiliated with CWA, was involved in bargaining and organizing and strike activity, much of it in the telephone industry with some of Kieran's favorite employers like AT&T and Verizon and cable TV companies, and oftentimes with call center workers, as well as telecom technicians. For the last 10 years, my main vehicle for union involvement has been as a member of the CWA affiliated News Guild out here in the Bay Area. We have a guild local based in San Francisco that allows freelance journalists to join. So I've been involved in that for the last 10 years and worked with Brother Randy First, who's on the call, on the Zoom, on a reform campaign in the Guild that kicked off 3 years ago that I hope he talks more about and I'll mention in a minute. First, let me say that as someone who spent 30 years trying to encourage lots of workers in the public and the private sector to join an established union rather than an independent union, I thought Joe's discussion of those options in chapter 6, which is entitled Class Struggle Organizing, was very good and very relevant. Though I would say that in the last couple of weeks, as a result of the unexpected victory of the Amazon labor union in Staten Island, the scales have tipped a little bit more away from the options of conservative business union backing for a new organizing or a labor liberal union backed organizing effort in the direction of do-it-yourself organizing, forming an independent union, foregoing the resources, the experience, good or bad, all the baggage, good or bad, that organizing through the vehicle of a traditional established union brings, versus trying to go it on your own with a much more rank and file approach. And it's an astonishing victory. Not clear whether the model is going to be reproducible yet, even elsewhere in Amazon. But for a group like this to have hung together, to have broken one major big rule about not filing for a contested board election with less than a card majority and winning nevertheless, definitely has hopefully opened many people's eyes to other alternatives, and Joe describes them and helps readers weigh them, I think, very well in chapter 6. The other thing I want to say very quickly before, because we want to let participants jump in, and I hope Randy first jump in. Within CWA over the last 3 years, within the News Guild affiliate of CWA, the News Guild, like the flight attendants that Joe works for, used to be a separate AFL-CIO union, but is now part of CWA, has bargaining rights for 26,000 people, has traditionally, in my experience, been a conservative business union, a little bit more than a dysfunctional club of incumbent officials, handful of members, an organization that did not encourage anything, remotely smacking of class struggle unionism, never really embraced CWA's, depending on your point of view, watered down version of that in the form of membership mobilization and contract campaigning and militant strike activity that CWA is deservedly well known for in the phone industry, at least. But 3 years ago, and this really illustrates the point that Joe makes about the connection between electing new leadership, not being a sufficient precondition for institutional revitalization, but being one component of it. 3 years ago, a young guy, 32 years old, coming out of a newly organized unit of 450 people at the LA Times, John Schlois, got pissed off at the national union bureaucracy, the Guild, about the way they were handling first contract negotiations in his unit. And without ever having been a union steward or a chief steward or a local president or having completed the process of negotiating a first contract, he decided to run for national union president with the help of longtime Guild activists like Randy, who was a key supporter, and reform leaders in other locals that had started to develop new leadership in response to this moribund national union bureaucracy. And we went through 2 contested elections in 2019. They stole the first one. We had to have a rerun. John won the second. And I would say over the last 2 years, this has been a case study in how a reformer running for office, in his case, without even a full reform slate, but that'll be different, hopefully, in the next election this coming winter. We have a Guild president now encourages members to go to Labor Notes conference, a Guild president who does Labor Notes troublemaker workshops, someone who supports members in newly organized new media and old media units to go out on work stoppages and to build community labor alliances to take on big corporate giants in the industry. It's been a night and day difference in 2 years, and much more work needs to be done. But if you're looking for within our own union, Joe's union, my union, Randy's union, I hope Randy talks more about this, a case study in institutional transformation triggered by new organizing, new leaders emerging from that organizing and from reform campaigns to change the leadership in locals, you couldn't do better than the Guild.
Is that where you're ending, Steve?
I am. I'm
Very good.
I'm trying to
Clean up
stick to my
All right.
5-minute time limit.
There you go. Okay. So, Joe, do you want to offer anything in rejoinder before we go to the great group of folks we have in the audience?
Yeah, I'll keep it brief. Look, it's what a great group of panelists. I've known all of them for a while, and admire all their work. I think I'll just go through a few points that folks made. Is I agree with Jane. I mean, look at the idea. These sort of young leftists. The thing that I like about it is that, and I think this is different than what we saw 10 years ago or 15 years ago, is that there's a new generation kind of seeking out new ideas. So I think, there's been a lot of talk about, some of the interviews that the Amazon workers in Staten Island did, the organizers, about them reading like Foster's The 1919 Steel Strike, and it's like, who the hell is talking about that, for decades, So I think that's cool. I think when I see the, Amazonians United, which has a different model, of not going for elections, but they also have a very different and critical view and very self-confident, like, we're not going to follow the labor pundits. We're going to go out and kind of research theory and come up with our own way. So I think all of that's good. In terms of, I think my thought overall, maybe it's what period we're looking at. I think clearly over the last couple of decades, though, if I compare it to like the 1980s or when I started in the labor movement, I think there was still the remnants of the sort of 70s left out there, and I think they had a little more cohesive sort of ideology. So when the national rank and file against concessions and it really had this sort of, I saw more as a trend, and I think the reform movements were more seen cohesively as part of a different alternative for the labor movement. Certainly Jane, your work's like, against the team concept. And I know Peter and I worked on Randy, we worked on that in Minnesota. But it was all kind of, I thought there was more of a coming together on these ideas. So, but I do agree with Jane, like the sort of, there's something new out there that's different in terms of how, especially younger folks are thinking about labor theory, and that's definitely what we need. Just real quickly, I think Shireen touched on, one of the dangers of writing a book like Class Struggle Unionism, and you start throwing around terms like labor liberalism and so forth, is, the folks, who misuse stuff, and want to get out there and criticize every strike and so forth. I've been bargaining, pretty much straight for, 25 years, so, I know the hard decisions that our committees go through at the end of bargaining, and for people who are outside who have no relationship to the workers or the struggle or no knowledge of the strike and kind of what the pressures were, I think that's a danger. One of our dangers is being conservative, but it's also, folks operating too much off of ideas and not off of actually doing stuff, which is, one of the problems that happened to the left, the labor leftists in the 1970s. Kind of losing touch with reality. Kieran, I think you had a lot of stuff in there. I think, I write about it and I talk about it, but, we can't have class struggle unionism if we don't have class struggle tactics. I mean, if we're not able to break free from the controls that are on us, then new folks coming in, and whether you're leading and stuff, you're going to be forced with the same sort of tough choices unless we break through and develop new choices. And I know that, the AMFA stuff that you talk about, I think there were some key lessons from that that were key. I do think, like, kind of going back to it kind of ties in with the previous comments that, when I think of demands, I think of stuff like that are both for your workplace, but broader. So like no concessions, coming together as both a particular in your workplace and demanding that the labor movement kind of embrace that. And I think it can matter. I think we did that in the flight attendants, when the pandemic hit, and it was early on, and there was like, how are we going to respond to it? And Sarah Nelson, and, we got together a meeting of all the flight attendants in the industry. Jane spoke at it actually. And it actually worked, because we put out a line that we were not going to do concessions. It wasn't even on the table. And it helped our leaders kind of when the employers came to them, and it helped. It just said it, and the employers got the message. They didn't even try. That, they tried a couple of times and then they stopped. I think, Karen, we've talked about the general strikes and stuff. I think that, there is it's kind of a subsided, with the thing of people calling general strikes, that they were doing. I would say that I won't talk about everything, but I think the Wisconsin, I think folks, I think when mass upsurges happen and people come out in the street, no one makes them go out in the street, and no one makes them go back, and they go back and they stop because they're rational and they figure out what they want to do. It's like a group idea. And there was a vote, and the legislators came back, the Democrats caved, and they came back and they voted. And I think the upsurge had its end. So I think we need to kind of think of upsurges, both in terms of we don't always control them, and often no one controls them. And finally, I'll just say, Steve, I really, I think when I was writing this book and I was looking at labor liberals, and you never used the term, but, I always looked at your books, right? And like analyzed, and how did you talk about the leaders, coming into SEIU? I think you wrote real practically, but you never kind of, you weren't kind of subscribing it to a sort of vision of unionism, but I think your sort of effort in doing that. And I think that's one final point, is that kind of ties in with Shireen's question, is I don't think that, I think people need to write more, and I think we need people who share the class struggle trend. There's all these publications where we can get the word out and we can kind of make a difference. And I think ideas matter. And I know Labor Notes does that, but I know there's a lot of space to be writing articles, and the void gets filled by these people who, frankly, put out bad ideas. And we need someone out there who can pick up the torch and kind of keep an eye on SEIU or, some of these other unions and start writing more. And we get relatively little written about like the UAW reform movement, I mean, I know it's covered, Labor Notes has covered it some, but compared to everything else that gets covered, I think there's a real shortfall. And part of that is we need to get more people who, share, sort of, a lot of them are tied up in activism, but, cutting aside some time to think theory and write it up, I think is important. Anyway, I'll stop there, Peter.
Thank you, Joe. So let's open it up. Let's be creative about how we're going to do this. I think Bailey, and again, I want to mention to those of you who've come on that we're relying on my friend Bailey Ethier handling the tech. Bailey, you want to enable the chat?
Yes, I have enabled the chat.
Thank you. So if you're comfortable using the chat, if you want to speak, you can raise your physical paw or use the mechanical hand raise function, and let's see what we can get going. And Randy first, surprise, surprise, Randy is first to raise his mechanical hand. So Randy, please.
I guess I had to raise it after what Steve said. So, but I did want to say a couple of things. I certainly appreciate, based on your other works, I'm sure this is a great one, and I look very much forward to reading the book, Joe. Just speaking briefly about the News Guild, talk about news that has, especially you would think there'd be more reporting on the News Guild than there has been, but John Schlois was part of a handful of people that organized the LA Times, which had fought unionism for 130 years. And as they were mobilizing, trying to unionize the place, they discovered just how problematic the international union was. In some ways, it was a little bit like what's happened at Amazon in New York. They did this themselves, and just when they saw how useless things were at the international level, he decided he was going to run for office. And in my opinion, what has developed is beyond my wildest dreams in terms of what's going on. In the last couple of years, 2-3 years, there are more than 100 new units of the News Guild. I would bet you that there are more organizing of different units than any other union in the country. We've organized 5,000 new workers in a small union, so it's very dramatic, and and again, the battle to get contracts is being waged not so much by staff, but by mobilizing the members in the newspapers. It's just a remarkable development, and I think it's sort of a reflection of what is maybe going on in labor in general, because a lot of these are young workers who are just fed up, and they are organizing. Some of the newspapers that have fought unionism for, from the Dallas Times to the Miami Herald, and papers all over the country. So it's a very, very exciting development and reflection, I think, what's going on in the country. Thank you.
Thanks, Randy. We have a comment and a question in the chat from Jordan Thompson. Jordan, do you want to speak and make it, or do you just want me to read it out? Oh, I'll go ahead and read it out then. He's curious to see, asking Joe and the rest of us, how do we see class struggle unionism interacting with electoral politics? And he mentions James Naylor's book about the Canadian CCF, The Fate of Labor Socialism, shows that the party was built by Marxists, not social democrats. And again, Jordan asks, what are your thoughts about unionists trying to work also in electoral politics? Or is your book suggesting that we should focus only on controlling the shop floor and striking? So Joe, do you want to respond to that?
You know, when I wrote the book, I tried as much as I could to step back and represent the views of class struggle unionists more broadly, and realizing that within the class struggle trend, there's all kinds of different, viewpoints about how much do we, some people want independent unions and don't believe in working within the AFL unions. Others do, some, all of that. And I think this is one of the questions where within class struggle unionists, there's a variety of views about how much effort we should put into building a labor party. I probably, in retrospect, short-circuited it because it's not really my thing, electoral politics in general. I do talk about needing to break from the Democrats, and I have a subchapter there. Honestly, people can talk about it, but I think if we can't build like class struggle, sort of actions and trends, it's hard to see us really getting a labor party or any electoral manifestation that's going to really mean anything. I think what my sort of analysis of history is if we can build a strong class struggle union where we're having frequent strikes, industry-wide strikes, I think that we can have the politics follow. I think trying to sort of get the politics going before we've really gotten the struggle going, I don't see it really working. So it's not really my focus, honestly.
Thanks, Joe. Paul, you've raised your mechanical hand. You're next up.
Yeah, thanks everyone. This is just such a great discussion. I got so much out of this, and thanks Joe for writing like an awesome book. I think, I guess I'm gonna have a roundabout way to get to my question, because when we had the teacher strike here in Minneapolis a few weeks ago, I know Kieran and Kip Hedges and other people put together like a little like union support MFT rally. I think we got around, I don't want to be the one doing the count, but I think we got around like 200 people there, I'd say. A decent number of unions sponsored. I think we had 4 other people, so more than a couple from my workplace came. I'm in UFCW, I work at the Steward Co-op, and it was really great. I think like hearing the speeches there was really good, and like Shireen and Kieran, you both gave like really incredible speeches. And kind of at the end, there was someone there who was from was talking about like how much she got out of it and stuff. So I went over to talk to her, and she was an AFSCME member who worked at Hennepin Tech, where the leader there just had that big scandal. And I had known, so I asked her about it. I had known it was reported that this guy had this big scandal and resigned. It turned out there was this whole it was a whole kind of shop floor thing where like all of the workers had like gone into this whole meeting, and they had tried to do a town hall and contain it, and all the workers got organized and like they like forced them to fire. Well, he didn't get fired, but reassign this guy. And it wasn't ever reported at all. So I think that kind of I was like, yeah. I'm like, you need to write this up, right? Like, so it really, I think what some people have been saying, like, it is really, if we are going to have to start, writing our own stuff. I try and do it, but I think that's going to be really necessary. I think the question I have is kind of coming from that. Like, that was a really cool event. It was like 200 people. I'm like, okay, next time we have a strike, we can get like, hopefully maybe we can organize more and get like 2,000 people or something like that. But, this is, I think Jane brought this up, is the question of like, is this a really cohesive trend yet? You know, I don't know, like as a young person entering the labor movement, I had to really find my own way. Like I had to Google stuff. I had to really look hard and find mentors. And like, luckily I've found like good mentors to have. But it really actually like took me having to put through the effort, because the stuff I got in the news with like, get a staff job, be a staff organizer, coming from my position, like, middle class liberal arts kid, I was like, I don't think that's the right move. But it took me having to have that initiative. And the question is like, how do we get to that place where we're like a young person entering the workplace? Like, luckily, like, thank God I'm in Minneapolis, right? Like there's a bunch of people here that are going to help me out. But I know people in other cities, like I know Starbucks workers, in other cities, like in Phoenix, Arizona. I'm like, I don't know the class struggle unionists in Phoenix, Arizona. I don't know if there are unionists in Phoenix, Arizona, right? So like, how do we make a place where that we can get these people to come and make this trend? Hopefully, I'm hoping I'm going to be at Labor Notes this summer, and I think I know it'll be great. But I think I feel like there has to be something a little bit more than that.
Well, you missed the early discussion, Paul, where we decided it was going to be TikTok. So if there is anybody on the conversation this evening who would like to undertake launching a class struggle unionism TikTok, is it a page? I'm not sure what the noun is, but we have a market for you. Jane, please.
Yeah, just a tiny point. Yes, Paul, you are lucky to be there in Minneapolis. And the Meeting the Challenge committee that Pete referenced earlier, that existed a while ago, that brought together a lot of the good elements of the Twin Cities labor movement. Its first meeting actually happened at a Labor Notes conference in a hotel bedroom. People didn't even necessarily know each other. But somebody said, hey, everybody from the Twin Cities get together. And out of that came the Meeting the Challenge that lasted for years. So more things like that need to happen at this next Labor Notes conference too. Oh, and I'm just going to drop one other little fact in here. I don't know what to say about this fact, but I just learned it an hour or so ago, that Derek Palmer, one of the two main leaders of the Amazon labor union, met with Sean O'Brien, the president of the Teamsters, today. What are they going to do? I don't know.
Yeah, I think they were doing a DC trip. He met with Sarah Nelson too. She had a picture of him. Yeah, I think that, Peter, I think Labor Notes is obviously the, sort of key gathering point for militants, and it has been for decades, right? Both the magazine and I think the conference. And, I think there's, it attracts people with all different ideas. There'll be all different ideas put out there. But if you're looking to, hook up with people who have, sort of militant ideas, that's a place. And then I think, as we discussed before, I think there's a lot of development of ideas that's taken place that really didn't happen for the last couple decades. I mean, people who knew it from before probably knew it, but this whole thing, like all of a sudden people are reading Kim Moody's, the rank and file strategy, which was written in 2004, right? But all of a sudden, you see all these articles about it, that there was a whole period, like 15, 20 years, where you're not really seeing that sort of discussion. I've already talked about the Amazon workers, which came as a surprise to me. How ideologically, sort of, developed they were in terms of doing their work, which makes sense. And you don't know it from the outside. So hopefully, I think more of that will be out there and get written up, so that when people come in the labor movement, I think it shouldn't be quite as hard as it is.
Shireen has put some info in the chat. Shireen, would you please tell folks who Minnesota Workers United is and
Sure.
what you're planning to do on May Day?
Sure. So Minnesota Workers United came together originally to support the nurses when they were going on strike, and then have been kind of coming together around any number of strikes or possible strikes for a number of years, and help to coordinate solidarity efforts for the MFT educators strike just this past round. And we're working on a May Day march, as we've done for a couple of years. And so I just shared a link in the chat for that. Hope that folks can join. Plans are still kind of in formation because everyone was busy with doing strike support.
I'm waiting for that march that comes across the Lake Street Bridge so that we can have both Minneapolis and St. Paul connected. So keep that in mind. Matt Carson has put something in the chat. Matt, do you want to read it yourself?
I can if you'd like me to.
Yeah, sure, please.
Okay, thanks, Joe. I'm wondering how you think a class struggle union current might develop in unions with hiring halls and pre-hire master agreements like construction unions. It seems to me that that's a fundamentally business unionist approach because of how it's structured. Do we need to get away from those sort of agreements entirely, or is there something else we should be looking at? I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, so I mean, when you look at what a lot of the construction unions have done is, they've reached these agreements and basically tried to prove to employers that they can add value, and they consciously, have to work to keep their labor costs down. Otherwise, they're not going to get the work and the market share, or else they're relying on government contracts or prevailing wage contracts. It's not a recipe for, it's not a recipe for reviving construction unionism and rebuilding density in the industry, right? It's a way of just surviving. I don't claim to have any special expertise on the construction, but I do know I certainly followed the contract rejection out in the Pacific Northwest, where a group called the Peter McGuire Group that was on Facebook, named after the first founder of the Carpenters Union, who had a socialist background in his early years, I think, ideas. And they basically, they ended up voting down 4 contracts. And because, the union leadership, which is real bureaucratic, were saying, well, we need to keep the labor costs down and so forth. But they on their own got together and went out there. They vote 4 contracts down. They finally go out on strike very reluctantly. It was very, public and messy because they weren't picketing a lot of the sites. They seemingly wanted the strike to fail. They finally get the contract allegedly ratified. And then the international union subsequently comes in, probably of their own design, because they got their own agenda to take over more and more locals, but put them into trusteeship because it turns out that they had rigged the ratification votes. So clearly that was a class struggle approach that was taken by those members of the group out there. I think we also saw it at Hunts Point out in New York, where, rank and filers got together and waged a, terrific battle, and then ultimately were sold, they built a lot of pressure, and it was sold out by some of the unions splitting off and reaching agreements. So I think there's plenty of room, in sort of any industry for, sort of the implementation of a class struggle approach. And I think the building trades really needs it.
Great, thank you, Joe. So if you're watching us on Facebook, you can use the comment function on Facebook to ask questions or make comments. And we have one that's come in from the Facebook audience from my landsman, Ruben Latz. Ruben writes, "Thank you. How much hope can we take? from the Amazon Staten Island unionization and the local Starbucks efforts to unionize and other recent developments. We've talked some about that already. I don't know, Joe, anything you want to add?
Well, yeah, does anyone else want to? I feel like I'm doing a lot of talking, but and no, it's just I think the key is that, you know, the Starbucks, from what I've gathered, and I've, you know, talked to some of the organizers, and, you know, I think that you had the Workers United Union very involved in the sort of first campaign that was won. But the interesting thing is, you know, it sounds like a lot of these other campaigns, you know, were largely, you know, run by the workers involved, and wouldn't have happened if it had been just a staff-driven approach. So I think that that's really a sort of, I think Steve pointed it out, you know, that's a different model than we've been seeing, you know, for decades, which is this sort of meticulous staff-driven, you know, even if you're building a committee, it's still kind of somewhat centered in the staff. And this was more like a, you know, little mini uprising.
So I want to add that we had a program maybe 6 weeks ago with half-price bookstore workers, and four shops had unionized here in the Twin Cities, both UFCW 1189 and UFCW 663. And then I got an email last week from one of the rank and filers who was in that program and said now the half price campaign has gone national. I had not realized until we had the program that Half Price is the largest used book chain in the United States. And the workers who were part of the panel, and I think now with some of the language and vocabulary that Joe is giving us, the minute they won the union election, they began to bargain with management and individual stores about work schedules, about whether people who were being called shift supervisors ought to be part of the bargaining unit. And like nobody had explained to them that you're actually supposed to wait for contract bargaining to talk about these issues. And instead they immediately started to try to push for the issues that had motivated them in the first place. And they talked a lot about relationship building, and they talked about relationship building with customers and how important it was that customers came into the store and said, we're shopping in this store because you just voted for a union. So this kind of very grassroots momentum is something we're seeing in a lot of places, and a lot that's under the radar that we're not hearing about in the local media. So we're at 8:30, which was our advertised stop time. But let me see, is there perhaps one more question or comment following the chat? Lori Duke, do you want to ask your question in your own voice, sister?
Sure. I was just wondering what advice y'all might all have. I would be called green on this end of the world, but for public school employees in the state of Texas, I feel like it's just such a huge cloud of crazy. I don't even know where we begin.
Yeah, it's actually interesting. I'm actually here in Dallas, Texas.
Oh,
and last night we had an in-person meeting at the CWA hall downtown Dallas. We had about 60 people there, and there were a lot of public workers who came, a lot of teachers and other public employees, and we had some of this very same discussion. And they were telling me about the and some college professors, who some of whom had been terminated, were there. And I think we had a discussion about this very issue, with public employees not having the legal right to bargain in Texas, and we had discussion about how to motivate people and how to try and move things forward. One of the things I talked about to them is, it's not covered as much in this book, but my second book was called Strike Back, and it talks about the public employee strike wave of the 1960s, and how did they go from a situation where there were hardly any public employee unions in the late 1950s. There were virtually no strikes whatsoever because it was illegal in every state. Yet over the course of a decade, 4 million workers flocked to their public employee unions, and you had hundreds and hundreds of strikes involving millions of workers, even when it was illegal. Certainly more recently, we saw it in the red states, where teachers struck statewide, even though it was illegal. So I think there's a lot of lessons out there, and I think connecting up with some folks who are in similar situations. I know there's some good folks here if you're around the Dallas area, who are kind of searching for some of these answers too, and can certainly put you in touch with them.
I'm in Fort Worth, and I would love that.
Oh, okay. Okay. So my let me put my email.
Yeah, put your email in the chat. Yep.
And I'll get in
Great.
touch with them. And I know they're having a May Day event on May 1st. You probably could meet a bunch of them. And
Okay,
so
cool.
let me. Yeah.
Great.
Okay.
Great.
Great. No, that'd be awesome. And they'd
Yeah.
love to talk to you. So.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And I know that we at the Eastside Freedom Library are very concerned about the rising pressure to ban books, and see, much as auto workers may have wanted to fight to build electric vehicles, librarians and teachers can be fighting over making sure that books are available that are valuable to young people and other readers. I think there are interesting ways that we can bring these kinds of issues together. And again, to go back to what Kieran was saying earlier about the uprising here in Minneapolis and the impact that had, in the Black community and particularly among young people, and how that's carried into the labor movement as well. Shireen, you were talking about students. Yesterday you were talking about students organizing in support of the Minneapolis teachers. Give us a taste of that, please.
So there was a group of high school students, and there were a lot of high school students who turned out in support of the educators' strike, but there was a group of them in particular that came together that have been really involved in the organizing since the uprising, really is what brought a number of them together, and they used those kind of contacts and skills that they developed to then organize support within other students for the educators' strike, and did a couple of sit-ins at the Davis Center where the school board is and administration is based, and then did an occupation. But it was all of the leaders of it were folks who'd first come into contact during the uprising.
Great, thank you. Great, so thank you, Joe, for writing the book and prompting this conversation. And thank you, Jane and Steve and Kieran and Shireen. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm going to use the exercise the authority of the chair to just make an aesthetic comment. And as if you've been watching PBS NewsHour during the pandemic and you've noticed the bookcases and backgrounds and I want to say, Steve Early, you're never going to make it on PBS NewsHour with that bookcase.
Hey, if we have the big one, the earthquake hit anytime soon, I may be buried under that.
Yeah, well, we'll come and dig you out.
I keep my own books on the bottom shelf. I would not want to die of being hit on the head by one of them.
Very good. Well, thank you, everyone. And again, I also want to remind you that Monday evening via Zoom, Eastside Freedom Library will be hosting a conversation with Daisy Pitkin and her new book, On the Line, about organizing industrial laundry workers in Arizona in the first decade of the 21st century. And we have a panel of local union activists who have read Daisy's book and will be engaging with her. So hope to see you all again. Stay well, stay safe. Build class struggle unionism. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Peter. Nice seeing everybody.
Great.